When it comes to the 1930s and annexing other people's lands, there is one country that springs to mind, and that is of course Germany, even if they weren't the only ones doing it. One country that we don't tend to think of in this context is Norway. Indeed, they seem to have got all of that colonialism out of the way in the Viking Age already, doing it early. Norway had actually been a colony itself until 1905, belonging to Sweden, sometimes being represented by this.
What the hell is even that?
Which I talk more about in this video about the old Norwegian flag. Now, before that, Denmark had been the owner of Norway, and as a result, the higher levels of Norwegian society even spoke Danish, with there not really being a written form of Norwegian until into the 19th century. Norway's lack of independence goes back to 1380 and when Olaf Håkonsson became the king of both Denmark and Norway, which led swiftly to the creation of the Kalmar Union, which are so important that they get their own flag. This was basically a pan-Scandinavian entity, Denmark, Sweden and Norway all together, as well as some territories across the Atlantic. But in 1523, the Kalmar Union fell apart when there was a Swexit, Sweden left.
No, we understand you perfectly. Everyone in Sweden speaks English.
We also speak Norwegian, but not Danish. That is a garbage language for garbage people.
And Norway and Denmark remained. That was alongside those former Norwegian colonies of Iceland, the Faroe Islands and Greenland. Now this entity became known rather uncreatively by historians as Denmark-Norway, but I think we should take the Pakistan approach for this entity, where Pakistan is actually an acronym for Punjab, Afghania, Kashmir, Sindh and Baluchistan, so all of these various regions connected with Pakistan. And I came up with the name of Grikfadenor for Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Denmark and Norway. Let me know if that's a suggestion, historians of late medieval Scandinavia, but in any case, this entity in 1537 became more Denmark than Norway, with Norway being demoted to a junior partner and not a full kingdom by the Danes, and it was clear on which foot the boot was. Then after several centuries of this, in 1814, following the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark was deprived of Norway by the Treaty of Kiel, and Norway instead passed to Sweden. During this time, many Norwegians would emigrate to the United States, where some of them would fight in the American Civil War, mostly to avoid having to put up with... In the 1830s, a movement called National Romanticism took over. This focused on elements such as the natural landscape, the pure soul of the peasant being the real embodiment of the nation, and also looking back at a nation's history for its identity. In Norway, this often meant looking back to the Viking Age, the last time Norway had really been a strong political power on the world stage, including in their voyages of discovery across the North Atlantic to places like Iceland and Greenland. In particular, Greenland had been a Norse colony coming under Norwegian rule, but over the centuries, contact had largely been lost with those colonies on Greenland. Indeed, we now know that in the later 15th, maybe in the early 16th century, this colony did in fact die out entirely. And in 1721, when a Danish preacher went to spread the new Protestant message to those people on Greenland, he found that there were no Norsemen left on Greenland at all, and there were only the Thule, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, living there today. However, 2 years later, interest in the region expounded, and the new Bergen Greenland Company was founded in order to exploit its natural resources. Obviously, contact intensified at this point, and in 1814, at the Treaty of Kiel, which was the same one that gave Norway from Denmark to Sweden, a little is said about the status of Greenland. It mentions the Kingdom of Norway, as well as the dependencies, Greenland, the Faroes and Iceland not included, shall for the future belong to His Majesty the King of Sweden, thus indicating that Greenland, the Faroes and Iceland belonged to the Kingdom of Norway and that their sovereignty did not also transfer to the King of Sweden. So in 1905, when Norway did become independent from Sweden, they were clearly living in an age of empires.
Mandatum.
Where anyone who was anyone wanted their own place in the sun. or in the ice, as it would transpire for Scandinavia. And in 1919, it was Denmark that made the first shot, claiming for themselves Greenland. Now, initially, Norway went along with this, mostly because Norway was keen to press its claim on Svalbard, and so they sort of had an agreement about this. But things went sour in 1921 when the Danes attempted to exclude all foreigners from Greenland, including Norwegians.
Can I take a bit of
Grönland?
Love to, mate. Love to, but this is all mine and I want it all. So, gotta be a no.
After negotiations between the two countries, in 1924 an agreement was reached and a sort of uneasy status quo about Greenland ensued. However, as we can read on the Store Norske Leksikon, this wasn't the end of the matter. Det som lenge framstod som norsk politikk var å forhandle om garantier for norske økonomiske interesser på Øst-Grønland mot å godta dansk suverenitet. Denne linjen ble brutt da en ny og mer aktivistisk regjering kom til makten i Norge, og Ishavsrådet gikk inn for norsk okkupasjon i møte med et stadig sterkere dansk nærvær. What appeared to be Norwegian policy for a long time was to negotiate guarantees for Norwegian economic interests in East Greenland in return for accepting Danish sovereignty. This line was broken when a new and more activist government came to power in Norway, and the Arctic Council advocated Norwegian occupation in the face of an increasingly strong Danish presence. And this occupation would come in 1931, when the Arctic explorer Halvard Dervold, one of the founding members of the Arktisk Næringsdrift, or the Arctic Trading Company, arrived in eastern Greenland and raised the Norwegian flag in Myggbukta, which funnily enough means the Bay of Mosquitoes in Norwegian. And so the Norwegians had planted a flag in eastern Greenland, and in fact the Norwegian government, soon after this was done, officially sanctioned it and claimed the territory for Norway.
Grönland.
Their new colony they would name Erik Raudes land, which means Erik the Red's land, obviously being named after Erik the Red, the Norse explorer who had gone that way in the Viking Age. They argued that because there were no Inuit living there, and in fact the vast majority of its population were made up of Norwegian trappers, this could be considered terra nullius, and so they had a right to claim it as their own, as well as historical backing. This area was made up of 3 large stations, Jonsby, Myggbukta and Antarktikhavn, and the population wasn't particularly large. However, the Danes still disagreed with Norway's action, as they had claimed all of Greenland for themselves and decided to take it to a higher power. This would be the start of Grønlandssaken, or Grønlandssaken in Norwegian, the Greenland affair. Now, unlike going about it as they might have done several centuries ago,
I will drink from your skull!
They instead decided to take it to the International Court of International Justice.
Today the gods will decide your fate!
And after several months of negotiation, they would rule in favour of Denmark, and Norway respected the decision and backed down.
But not for long!
In 1940, Norway was invaded by the Germans, and a new government was put in place made up of Vidkun Quisling and his National Samling party. Now, he wanted a stronger Norway and strongly advocated for the Norwegians to take over Greenland as a colony. He was hoping, because he was actively working with the Germans, who had also taken over Denmark, that Germany might look favourably on such a restoration of Greenland to Norwegian power. And towards this end in 1941, he sent the Norwegian ship SS Buskå with a very small crew over to establish communications in Greenland, involving the same Halvard Dervold as before, and a German radio operator who would broadcast on Allied shipping. However, enter Uncle Sam, because the Americans had also been in talks with the Greenland government. Greenland was of course being administered by Denmark, and with Denmark taken over by the Germans, the Greenland administration had wanted to ensure its protection from the Axis powers, and so had enlisted American support to do so. The Americans' Coast Guard had gone down the coast of eastern Greenland and found the ship and its crew and promptly arrested them. In fact, we can read in the New York Times from 1941, Nazi spy ship caught in Arctic. The seized vessel, so sea-worn that little of her paint remained, was ketch-rigged and equipped with an auxiliary steam engine. Norwegian colours flew at her masthead and were painted on her sides. She was extremely filthy, according to members of the prize crew. Piled on the deckhouse were skis and dog sleds, and a husky and a huge black Newfoundland dog wandered about the decks. Because America was still neutral at this point, having not entered the war, the charge on which they arrested the Norwegian crew was illegal immigration, and they were interned for some time in the United States before being released to go back to Norway. The German radio operator was not. He was held for the rest of the war, and indeed American troops would safeguard Greenland's neutrality for the rest of the war. The Norwegians government that was collaborating with the Germans actively pushed the Germans to attempt an invasion of Greenland, but the Germans rejected this quite quickly because of the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic and the impracticability of this move. But it remains an interesting topic of discussion. What would history have been like if Norway had kept that little bit of Erik the Red's land? Then I suppose we'd have a Danish Greenland and a Norwegian Greenland. Perhaps we could talk of an Eastern Greenland and a Western Greenland, the same way we'd have East and West Germany. But most likely this plan was doomed to failure, as of course when the Germans lost the war, it seems unlikely that this fascist regime in Norway would have kept its possession of that little part of Erik the Red's land. But nonetheless, an interesting topic for discussion. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching this video about the Norwegian occupation of Eastern Greenland in the 1930s and its short-lived proposal to do so in the 1940s as well. Let me know in the comments below, did you know about Greenland's shared history and Norway's designs on taking it back? It is interesting that Denmark was the power that would go on to keep it and indeed Iceland and the Faroe Islands as its own colonies when it was largely Norwegians who went out and discovered and settled it throughout history. But I suppose to the victor go the spoils. Well, certainly that's the case in the Kalmar Union. Anyway, let me know in the comments below what other videos you would like to see me make, anything on related topics, and I'd be happy to look into it. And a huge thank you to all the patrons for their enduring support in making it possible to make these videos. Thank you all for watching. I have been Hilbert. Ha det bra, ha det go, and I will see you in the next one. Oh, and this was the history.